His back slammed into the unforgiving stone of the corridor wall, the impact a brutal thief that stole the air from his lungs. A large, cruel hand was fisted in the front of his threadbare tunic, pinning him in place. He smelled the Beaterag Euros Trade's center Euros acrid sweat and smug aggression Euros and instinctively squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the blow he knew was coming. This was a familiar dance, one he had been forced to learn since childhood. Make yourself small. Endure. Wait for it to be over. It thinks Eater Euros Trade's important now, the first courtier sneered, his voice a low rumble of contempt. He shook Mason like a dog with a rat. The Kinder Euros Trade's little pet scribe. You are nothing. A speck of dust. Mason didn't Euros Trade T fight. He didn't Euros Trade T speak. His entire world had narrowed to the rough texture of the stone against his spine and the impending pain. He was a blank, an unscented omega, a flaw in the grand tapestry of his Dragonkin clan. He was used to this. He was built for this. But then, something shifted. It wasn't a Euros Trade T a sound, not at first. It was a sensation, a sudden, profound theft of warmth from the air, as if a door to a winter dimension had been thrown open. The beater holding him faltered, his knuckles loosening their grip. A deep, unnatural chill crept through the hallway, a cold so absolute it felt like it was leeching the very life out of the stone. Enough. The word was not shouted. It was a low, grinding vibration that seemed to emanate from the foundations of the fortress itself, the sound of tectonic plates shifting deep within the earth. It was a voice devoid of heat, of passion, of anything but an ancient, soul-crushing weariness. Both beaters froze, their faces draining of all color, their earlier bravado evaporating into sheer, primal terror. At the far end of the corridor, cloaked in the deepest shadows, stood a figure of absolute stillness. King Malachi. He was a specter carved from obsidian and despair, his presence a black hole that consumed all light and warmth around it. His dead gray eyes, like storm clouds over a frozen sea, were fixed on the man who held Mason captive. He didn't need to move, he didn't need to raise his voice. His gaze alone was a promise of a slow, cold, and terrible annihilation. The beater released Mason as if his tunic had become white-hot iron, stumbling backward and crashing to his knees in a desperate, panicked bow. But to understand the crushing weight of that silence, the terrifying significance of the Kinder Euros Trade's intervention, we must go back to the beginning. Back to a great hall suffocating under the heat of 100 nervous dragons, and an offering of last resort. The torment began with the heat. It was a physical entity in the great hall of the Cinderfall clan, a crushing, suffocating blanket woven from the collective body heat of 100 anxious dragonkin and the steam of their palpable fear. The air was thick with the scent of ozone, superheated metal, and the cloying sweetness of ceremonial incense meant to appease a king who was beyond appeasement. Mason kept his gaze locked on the scuffed leather of his own boots, the only safe patch of ground in a world engineered to reject him. He focused on the familiar patterns of wear over the toes, the way the stitching had begun to unravel near the ankle Euros, a small, pathetic universe of decay that he could, at least, comprehend. He was a phantom attending his own sacrificial rites. All around him, the hall thrummed with the low, guttural vibrations of his clan. The Alphas were mountains of muscle and pride, their formidable scales peeking from beneath fine silks, their scents sharp and commanding, like lightning strikes and burning forests. The beaters stood watchful and stern, the loyal spine of the clan. And the Ungarser Euros, the Omegas, were living jewels, masterpieces of biology. They stood beside their families, their skin shimmering with a faint, latent magic. Some had small, perfect horns curling like polished jet from their temples. Others possessed tails tipped in elegant, scaled spades that swayed with nervous grace. Their scents were intoxicating symphonies designed by nature to captivate Euros, summer thunderstorms, molten honey, rare night-blooming flowers. Scents that promised to soothe an alpha Euros trade in a fire, to ensure healthy clutches of eggs, and to forge a powerful lineage. Mason, by contrast, smelled of nothing. Or rather, he smelled of dust, old parchment, and the cool, disappointing scent of a rain-soaked stone. He was a blank slate, a cinder in a house of fire, an omega born without an inner flame. The shame of it was a physical weight that bore down on his shoulders, making the cheap, threadbare wool of his tunic an instrument of torture against his skin. He had long ago mastered the art of making himself small, of folding into the shadows and praying for the mercy of invisibility. But on this day, there were no shadows deep enough to hide him. Today was the offering of appeasement, and his family had brought him forward not as a beloved son, but as a final, desperate gambit. He was the piece of refuse they were about to throw onto the pyre, hoping the smoke might momentarily please an angry god. Next, the heraldor Euros trade's voice strained, cracking under the pressure. The House of Embers presents their third-born Omega, Levi. A collective gasp of awe rippled through the assembled clans. That Omega who stepped forward was nothing short of breathtaking. His hair was the color of spun gold, and tiny, ruby-like scales glittered on his high cheekbones like constellations. His scent, even from across the vast hall, was a potent, intoxicating wave of cinnamon and burning cedarwood. He performed a deep, graceful bow before the throne, a perfect offering of beauty and fertility for the silent, brooding king. And on that throne sat the reason for all this pageantry and terror, King Malachi. Mason risked a sliver of a glance from beneath his lowered lashes. The stories whispered in hushed, fearful tones did not do him justice. The stories spoke of a monster, a tyrant whose rage could shatter mountains and boil rivers. The reality was infinitely worse. He was unnervingly still, a statue carved from despair and obsidian. He wasn't large and bloated with power like Mason Euros trade's own father. He was lean, corded with dense muscle beneath black, unadorned armor that seemed to be fused directly to his body. His long black hair fell like a silken shroud over a face of sharp, brutal angles. But it was his skin that held the true horror. It was a deathly, lifeless gray, and in the flickering torchlight, Mason could see a network of fine, hairline cracks spreading from his jawline and down the column of his neck, like a beautiful ceramic vase on the verge of shattering into 1,000 pieces. The curse was not a myth. It was visible, a creeping petrification that was slowly claiming him. His scent, too, was fundamentally wrong. Where a true Alpha Euros trade's presence should have been a furnace of power, dominance, and vitality, Malachi was a void. A pit of absolute cold. It was a chilling anti-scent that actively sucked the heat from the room, making the powerful dragonkin shiver and pull their opulent cloaks tighter around their shoulders. He raised a single gray hand. The fingers were long and elegant, but the nails were black and sharp as shards of dragonglass. With a flick of his wrist, he dismissed the golden Omega. There were no words, just a simple gesture of absolute, soul-crushing finality. A quiet, heartbroken sob escaped from Levi Euros trade's family as the beautiful Omega was led away. His golden head bowed in rejection. The farce continued. Chests overflowing with gold that had taken generations to amass were presented. Ancient swords, still humming with the potent magic of their forging, were offered. Oaths of fealty from powerful warlords, who dropped to their knees with their horned heads bowed to the stone floor, were sworn. Each offering was met with the same chilling silence, the same dismissive, indifferent gesture. The king wanted something, but no one in the realm knew what it was. The pile of rejected treasures grew at the foot of his throne, a monument to their collective failure and rising panic. Maison Eurostrade's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. He could feel his father Eurostrade's simmering rage building behind him, a volcano of shame and frustration. He could feel his mother Eurostrade's brittle anxiety, a high-pitched ringing in the air. He was their last offering, the final insult they could present to the stone-hearted king. The House of Cinderfall, the herald announced, his voice now ragged with exhaustion, presents Euros their son, Mason. A hard, unforgiving hand shoved him between the shoulder blades. He stumbled forward, catching himself just before he fell. The walk to the foot of the dais was the longest, most agonizing journey of his life. The polished stone floor stretched for what felt like miles, reflecting the mocking, pitying stares of the entire world. A low murmur spread through the hall, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. It was quickly followed by a few sharp, cruel snorts of derisive laughter. An ash-stained someone whispered the words loud and clear in the tense silence. Thayer Eurostrade re-offering him a blank. Look at him, another voice added. He Karner Eurostrade T even hold a proper shift. Pathetic. The words were stones, and they struck him with a dull, familiar pain. He kept his eyes down, his entire being focused on a single, monumental task. Do not shake, do not cry, do not give them the satisfaction. He reached the foot of the throne and dropped into a low, formal bow, his forehead nearly touching the frigid floor. The cold emanating from the king was a physical force, seeping through the thin wool of his tunic and chilling him to the marrow of his bones. My king, his father Eurostrade's voice boomed, full of a false sincerity that made Maison Eurostrade's stomach churn. We offer you our son. He is Euros literate, well-versed in history. His father Eurostrade's voice faltered, the lie dying on his lips as he failed to spin the pathetic truth of Maison Eurostrade's existence into anything resembling value. Silence. A vast, empty chasm of it. Mason could feel Malaysia Eurostrade's gaze on him, a heavy, dead weight pressing down. He waited for the flick of the wrist, the gesture of dismissal that would seal his fate. Would his father beat him here, in front of everyone? Or would he wait until the humiliation of their return home? I have no need of a scribe. Mason flinched as if struck. The Kinder Eurostrade's voice was not a roar of fury. It was a low, grinding sound like boulders shifting deep within the earth. It was a voice utterly devoid of heat, of life, of anything but weary, ancient pain. This was it. The end. But then, something sparked in the darkness of his mind. Not just a memory, but the culmination of 1,000 stolen hours. Years spent huddled in dusty back rooms, teaching himself the elegant, forgotten script from scrolls his father had deemed merely decorative and worthless. It was his only secret, his only small act of defiance against a world that had labeled him a blank. A specific passage from a crumbling scroll he Eurostrade read, hidden away in the deepest, most neglected archives of their keep. A mention of the first cursed king, of a tome filled with indecipherable text. A desperate, suicidal impulse seized him. What was one more humiliation before the inevitable end? "My king," he whispered, his own voice a dry, unused rasp he barely recognized. He didna euros trade T look up. He didna euros trade T dare. There is a text to euros from the elder days. The Griffina euros trade s lament. It is said to be written in the high tongue of the firstborn. No one has been able to read it for 1,000 years. The silence that followed was different. It was not empty. It was sharp, focused, a collectively held breath. He could feel the weight of the Kinder Euros trade's attention narrow onto him, as precise and dangerous as the point of a spear. He forced himself to continue, the words tumbling out in a nervous rush. "My clan has a copy in our archives. Euros, I can read it." His father made a choked, furious sound behind him. He had just revealed a secret, a potential treasure his father had not even known they possessed, let alone thought to offer. Slowly, deliberately, the sound of stone grating on stone filled the air. Mason risked a glance upward. King Malachi was leaning forward on his throne. It was the first time he had moved all evening. His eyes, which Mason had assumed were simply black, were a dull, lifeless gray. But deep within their cloudy depths, a tiny, dangerous spark had ignited. "You can read the high tongue," the king ground out, the words less a question and more a demand for confirmation. "Yes, my king," Mason breathed, his voice barely audible. Malachi stared at him for a long, terrifying moment, his gaze analytical. He studied Mason as if he were a strange insect, an unexpected piece of a puzzle he hadn't known was missing. The hall was so quiet Mason could hear the frantic rushing of blood in his own ears. Then the king leaned back. He raised a hand, not to dismiss, but to beckon. Two of his personal guards, massive dragonkin clad in black iron armor, stepped forward from the shadows. "The offering is accepted," King Malachi said, the grinding words echoing in the stunned hall. "He will come with me to Draknard. The tome will follow." Masona Euros trade's world tilted on its axis. A wave of dizziness washed over him, a disorienting blend of profound terror and something else he couldn't Euros trade name. It wasn't relief, and it certainly wasn't hope. It was merely a stay of execution. He was no longer his father Euros trade's garbage to be discarded. He was now the Kinder Euros trade's tool. He wasn't sure which fate was worse. The guards flanked him, their presence immense and intimidating. As they led him away from the dais, he saw his father Euros trade's face, pale with shock and incandescent with fury. And for the first time in his entire life, Mason saw a flicker of genuine fear in his father Euros trade's eyes. Fear of the king he had just tried to insult with his worthless, ash-stained son. The journey to Draknard was a blur of biting wind and even colder silence. He was placed in a covered carriage, alone, while the king and his retinue rode on massive, scaled war mounts whose footsteps shook the very earth. They climbed ever higher, leaving the green, temperate lands of his home behind for the harsh, unforgiving peaks of the Dragona Euros trade's Tooth Mountains. The air grew thin and sharp, and a deep, penetrating cold set in Euros, a cold that had nothing to do with the altitude. It was the chill of the Kinder Euros trade's curse, bleeding out from his body and poisoning his domain. When they finally arrived, Draknard was not a castle. It was a wound carved into the side of a mountain, a fortress of black volcanic rock whose towers clawed at the perpetually gray sky like skeletal fingers. There were no banners, no colors, no signs of life. The only sound was the wind howling through its crenellations with a mournful, lonely cry. It did not feel like a Kinder Eurostrade's home. It felt like his tomb. He was led through a massive gate into a courtyard paved with dark, uneven stone. Warriors drilled in silent, grim formations, their movements precise and deadly. Their scales were muted shades of gray, slate, and obsidian. No one spoke. No one smiled. The very air was heavy with a discipline born not of loyalty, but of fear. This was a pack forged in the crucible of their Alfred Eurostrade's pain. Mason expected to be thrown into a dungeon or, at best, a small, mean Servanta Eurostrade's cell. Instead, he was led deep into the fortress through winding corridors that grew ever colder, until he was brought before another dragonkin. This one was sleek and powerful, with silver scales that traced the sharp lines of his face and pale, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. He moved with a liquid grace, a stark contrast to the rigid, deathly stillness of the king. "So," the silver dragon said, his voice a smooth, dangerous purr. He circled Mason slowly, like a predator examining a strange new species of prey. "You are the little scribe, the miracle worker." His eyes raked over Masona Eurostrade's thin frame and his plain tunic. A faint, condescending smile touched his lips. "I must admit, I am underwhelmed." He leaned in close, his scent sharp and biting, like winter frost and fresh blood. It was a bitter Eurostrade's scent, but powerful and fiercely territorial. "I am Grayson, the Kinder Eurostrade's cousin, and his voice in this fortress." He deliberately sniffed at Masona Eurostrade's neck, and his nose wrinkled in theatrical disgust. An ash-stained, just as the rumors said. A blank, Havria Euros disappointing. Mason flinched back, pressing himself against the cold stone wall. "The king has commanded me to see to your accommodations," Grayson continued, his purr turning sharp as a razor Eurostrade's edge. "He may see some use in you, little cinder, but make no mistake. Here, you are nothing. You will speak only when spoken to. You will go only where you are permitted. And you will work. If you fail to produce results Euros well, the cliffs of Draknard are very high, and accidents are so very common for clumsy little Omegers." The threat was delivered with a charming smile, which made it all the more terrifying. Grayson gestured, and two guards seized Masona Eurostrade's arms. "Take him to the Great Library. Let him get acquainted with his new cage." The Great Library of Draknard was to be his cage, his prison, and paradoxically his sanctuary. The doors were 20 feet high, carved from petrified ironwood and bound with dull, blackened silver. When the guards pushed them open, the sound of grinding hinges echoed like a groan from the mountain itself. The air that rolled out was ancient, thick with the smell of decaying paper, dried ink, and a profound, undisturbed dust. And it was cold, a deep, subterranean cold that felt as if it had been trapped in this room since the dawn of time. The space was vast enough to be a cathedral to forgotten knowledge. Bookshelves soared into the oppressive gloom, far higher than any ladder could reach, creating narrow canons of learning. The only light came from high, slit-like windows near the ceiling, casting down weak, gray shafts of daylight that barely disturbed the shadows. Motes of dust danced in the pale beams like wandering spirits. It was a place of immense silence, a silence so heavy it felt like a physical presence. Grayson shoved him inside. "Here you will stay. Food will be brought twice a day. There is a small cot in the alcove to the left. Do not wonder. The king expects progress." The great doors boomed shut, and the sound of a heavy bar sliding into place echoed in the vastness. He was alone. utterly and completely alone. For a long moment, Mason simply stood there, trembling in the oppressive silence and the biting cold. This was it, a prison of books, a tomb of knowledge. It was a cruel, perfect irony. He took a hesitant step, his worn boots making no sound on the thick layer of dust covering the stone floor. He ran a hand along the spine of the nearest book. The leather was cracked and cold to the touch. He could feel the weight of centuries pressing down on him, the silent chorus of 1,000 forgotten voices. He had never felt so small. The fear was a cold knot in his stomach, but as his eyes adjusted to the gloom, another feeling began to seep through the terror, a strange, familiar comfort. He was surrounded by his only friends, his only true refuge. He was a prisoner, yes, a tool to be used and discarded. But here, in this cage, he was also the master. This was a world he understood. Language, history, text. Here, his worthless skills had meaning. He found the alcove Grayson had mentioned. A simple cot with a thin, scratchy woolen blanket was pushed against the wall. Beside it, a small table and a chair. This was his new home. He sat on the edge of the cot, the crushing weight of his situation settling over him. He was a long way from the familiar, casual cruelty of his family. This was a new kind of cruelty, cold, indifferent, and absolute. Days bled into one another, marked only by the silent delivery of a tray of bland food left just inside the doors. The tome from his clan arrived, a massive iron-bound book delivered by 2 grunting guards who dropped it on a central reading table with a thud that shook the floor. The Gryphina Eurostrade's Lament. Its cover was blank, its pages brittle with age. And so, Mason worked. He worked with a feverish desperation, because the work was the only thing that kept the madness at bay. The work was his shield against the howling wind outside, against the chilling silence within, against the ever-present fear of the stone-hearted king and his smiling, venomous cousin. He fell into the rhythm of the high tongue, its elegant, complex syntax, a puzzle that occupied every corner of his mind. He translated line by line, his quill scratching softly in the immense silence, the only sound in his universe. The library became his entire world. He learned its geography, the sections on war strategy, ancient lineage, and forgotten magic. He found its secrets. A loose stone in the wall behind which a forgotten scroll was hidden, a draft that whispered from a sealed-off corridor. Sometimes, when the fortress was utterly silent, he thought he could feel a low, resonant hum through the soles of his boots, a dormant power sleeping deep in the mountain Eurostrade's foundations. In a crumbling architecture Eurostrade's folio, he found a reference to it, an ancient defense system woven into the library itself, connected to the faint runes carved into the flagstones. He even found the command word Ethelgardiarna noting with academic curiosity that it translated to a circumflex Hearthwardina Eurostrade's bind. A circumflex Eurostrade. He dismissed it as a fanciful, long-dead mechanism, a piece of trivia for a forgotten age. The cold was his constant companion, seeping into his bones until he felt he might be turning to stone himself. He wore his thin cloak constantly, huddling over his work with numb fingers. He never saw the king. He only felt his presence, a constant, oppressive weight on the fortress. Sometimes, late at night, he would hear a distant, terrible sound echoing through the stunner a sound of grinding rock and pure, undiluted agony. He knew it was Malachi, alone in his chambers, fighting the curse that was slowly, inexorably consuming him. The sounds made the hairs on Mason Eurostrade's arms stand up, and he would pull his blanket tighter and force his eyes back to the text. his heart pounding with a strange mixture of terror and pity. Then, after what felt like an eternity or euros, perhaps a week, perhaps a month, he had lost all track of Timur Euros. He found it. He was deep into a chapter describing the lineage of the first dragon kings. Most of it was a dry recitation of names and deeds, but then, a passage written in a slightly different script, almost like a marginal note from the original author. His breath caught in his chest. And so the curse was laid, not by the sorcerer's spite, nor by the enemy's blade. The heart hardens from the chasm left by a brother's flight, the soul fractures from a bond betrayed. To mend the stone is not our feet of power's hold, but to welcome selfless warmth, and break the endless cold. Mason stared at the words, his mind reeling. It wasn't a Eurostrade to a spell. It was a riddle, a prophecy. The curse wasn't just magical, it was emotional. A broken bond, a betrayal, and the Courier Euro's selfless warmth. What did that even mean? It was vague, poetic, and utterly useless as a practical cure. But it was also the first real clue anyone had seen in 1,000 years. It changed everything. He sat back, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He had done it. He had found something. Now came the most terrifying part. He had her tell the king. The summons came that evening. The great bar on the library doors was drawn back with a deafening screech, and a guard stood silhouetted in the doorway. "The king will see you." The walk to the throne room was different this time. He was not our shamed offering, he was a messenger bearing a vital secret. But the fear was just as potent. He clutched the piece of parchment with his translation so tightly his knuckles were white. The great throne room was empty save for the solitary figure on the dais. The great fire pits were unlit, and the chamber was filled with a deep, profound chill. King Malachi sat on his throne, as still and silent as ever. "You have something for me, scribe," the grinding voice echoed in the cold, empty hall. Mason Eurostrade's throat was dry. He forced himself to walk forward and bowed low. "My king, I have translated a passage of significance. Show me." He ascended the steps of the dais, his legs shaking. He had never been this close to the king before. He could see the cracks on his skin with perfect clarity now. They looked like a fine web of gray lightning frozen on his flesh. His eyes were closed, his face a mask of weary torment. The cold coming of him was so intense it made Mason Eurostrade's teeth ache. With a trembling hand, Mason held out the parchment. Malachi did not take it. Slowly, his gray eyes opened. They were dull, clouded with pain, but they focused on Mason with an unnerving intensity. "Read it." Mason swallowed hard and read the passage aloud, his voice wavering slightly. When he finished, the silence descended again, heavier than before. Malachi did not move. He simply stared at Mason, his gaze unreadable. Had he failed? Was the clue too obscure? Would the Courier Eurostrade's disappointment now curdle into rage? Selfless warmth, the king finally rasped, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He said it not as a question, but as a statement of utter absurdity. A bitter, almost silent huff of air escaped his lips. It was the closest thing to a laugh Mason could imagine from him. "Leave me." Mason bowed again, his mind numb with confusion and fear, and backed away. As he reached the door, he risked one last look back. The king had not moved, but he had lifted one of his gray, stone-like hands and was staring at it, flexing the fingers slowly as if it belonged to a stranger. For the first time, Mason saw not a monster, but a prisoner trapped within his own body. He was dismissed back to his library, the heavy boom of the doors sealing him in again. He felt a hollow sort of despair. He had delivered his message. He had done his job, and it had changed nothing. The riddle was unsolvable. The king was still cursed, and he was still a prisoner. The next day, a small change occurred. The tray of bland food left for him included a small, withered apple. It looked like an afterthought, something grabbed from the bottom of a barrel. Mason suspected it was less a kindness and more a grudging acknowledgement that a scribe, like any tool, required minimal maintenance to function. Still, the crisp, tart flavor was a shock to his system. A few days later, he was fetching a pail of water when it happened. Two courtiers, both broad-shouldered beaters loyal to Grayson, cornered him. That was when a hand fisted his tunic, when his back hit the wall, and that was when the king appeared. After Malachi had disappeared back into the shadows, the two beaters scrambled away, their earlier bravado shattered. Mason was left alone in the hallway, his back pressed against the cold wall, his heart pounding in his throat. He slowly slid to the floor, his legs no longer able to support him. He hadn't been saved. He hadn't been rescued. He had been claimed like a book on a shelf, a sword on a rack. The king was not protecting him. He was protecting his property. A tool could not be broken by anyone but its owner. It was the most dehumanizing thought he ever had. And yet, back in the cold, dusty silence of his library, as he picked up his quill, his hand still shaking, a strange new feeling was settling in his chest. For his entire life, his weakness, his blankness, had been a magnet for cruelty. He had been a target, a plaything, a thing to be kicked to prove another Eurostrade's strength. Now, that weakness was shielded by the greatest, most terrifying power in the land. He was a tool, yes, a possession, but he was the King Eurostrade's possession, and the king did not suffer others to touch what was his. A few days after that, one of the silent, black-armored guards entered the library. He didn't speak, but placed a heavy, fur-lined blanket on Mason Eurostrade's cot and a small, functional oil lamp on his desk. As the guard turned to leave, he spoke in a gruff monotone. His Majesty cannot have his translator going blind in the gloom or freezing to death. It is inefficient. Efficient. The word echoed in Mason Eurostrade's mind. It was not a gift of comfort, but a tune-up for a machine. And yet that night, as he wrapped himself in the profound warmth of the fur, the cold that had settled deep in his bones began, for the very first time, to recede. The King Eurostrade's shield was an invisible, yet palpable thing. Life in the library settled into a new routine. The open scorn from the Castlier Eurostrade's inhabitants curdled into a resentful, fearful silence. He was still the useless, ash-stained Omega, but now he was untouchable. The fortress was still a cage, but for the first time in his life, Mason felt he might just survive it. The riddle of the curse still haunted him. The words, a circumflex selfless warmth the Eurostrade, a constant, mocking puzzle. But now, a new question had taken root in his mind. He was a prisoner in a fortress of cold stone, owned by a king who was turning into stone himself. He was protected not by kindness, but by a chilling sense of ownership. And he had to wonder, in this kingdom of cold, what would it even take to create a single spark of warmth? So, what do you think? What could a circumflex selfless warmth the Eurostrade possibly mean for a king who seems to feel nothing but cold and pain? And do you believe his protection over Mason is a sign of something more, or is it truly just a master protecting his tool? Let me know your theories in the comments below. If you were captivated by Mason and Malachi's story, don't forget to hit that like button. And if you want to find out what happens next in the Fortress of Shadows, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss a single chapter.